Hello, my name is Tim Ashwell. I teach at Komazawa University in Tokyo. This presentation is called Multimethod Research into Teacher Agency. The starting point for this research project was the students in my English teaching methodology classes at Komazawa. I wondered why, when they do a model lesson, do they seem to teach in the ways they were taught? And I also wondered why they seem to be wedded so closely to the textbook. I assumed that they taught in ways that they were taught because this was all they had to go on, and I assumed that they followed the textbook closely because this is what their teachers at school had done. There was also a critical juncture when I was listening to a plenary talk given at JALT 2019 about teacher efficacy. It was a very interesting and entertaining plenary, but I was rather alarmed when the speaker declared that schools in Japan practice something which has no connection at all to TESOL. The implication seemed to be that English teachers in schools here in Japan are benighted and living in a backwater wholly removed from those of us teaching in universities and language schools. I felt I wanted to find out about how junior high school English teachers actually teach, the rationales they give for the ways they teach, and I wanted to stick up for them. Another starting point was this book, which reports the findings of a research study carried out in Scotland to see how or whether experienced secondary school teachers there were willing and able to implement a new curriculum initiative. In the book, the authors define teacher agency, but it is first worth attempting to define what is meant by agency itself. This is, in fact, an extremely thorny problem, but in social science, agency is usually defined as the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. More simply put, it is the degree to which we can exercise control and are free to make decisions of our own. However, the definition offered in the Priestley Teacher Agency book emphasizes that when we talk of teacher agency, this is not an individual capacity. Rather, it is something that emerges in contexts for action. In other words, agency is not so much located in the individual, but emerges as a result of the interaction between the individual and the environment, and through factors in the past, the present, and the future. This diagram from the book shows how the writers conceive of teacher agency. The ideas, values, and beliefs that teachers have, and the discourses and language they use to perform, share, and think about their practices all affect their sense of agency in the present, as do the relationships, roles, power, and trust that teachers have with colleagues and students. In addition, the school and classroom environment and the textbook and other materials they use will affect their sense of control and freedom. However, past experiences and educational opportunities also shape the ways teachers conceive of their own scope for action, as do the goals, both short and long term, that they project into the future. Teacher agency thus results from a complex amalgam of factors. It is not static and confined only to the here and now, nor is it simply an individual trait or ability. It is something that manifests itself as the result of interactions between the individual and the environment, and combines reflections on the past and projections into the future with beliefs in the present. So let me talk now about my own research project and the phases I went through as I sought to explore and understand how teacher agency is manifested by junior high school English teachers. My first impulse was to make a questionnaire which mainly focused on materials use as a way of opening up teachers' sense of agency. I thought that I could send the questionnaire to as many teachers as possible and would be able to gain insight into teachers' thought processes and beliefs through analysing the responses. However, for some reason, I paused and realised that I didn't know for sure how junior high school English teachers teach. It is 35 years since I last regularly visited junior high schools. I didn't know how much things have changed. I also set myself a challenge. Rather than collecting responses to a questionnaire, I wondered whether I could accurately and dispassionately describe what teachers do. Rather than making judgments based on what teachers say they do, I wanted to see if I could begin to understand what they do and why they do it first by describing as accurately as I could what they do and then asking them to explain their rationales. So, in phase 1 of the project, which lasted from October last year until February this year, I did 17 class observations of 5 teachers in 4 junior high schools in my hometown, making detailed notes of regular lessons. I took video to corroborate my notes and asked the teachers to check my notes. This gave me a sense of the techniques and routines that 5 teachers in my part of Tokyo use. I then asked them to fill out a questionnaire which mainly focused on materials use, but which also covered lesson planning, and at the end included questions about freedom and control and goals and beliefs. Then finally, after reading the teachers' responses to the questionnaire, I noted things I wanted to confirm with them and asked them about these in an interview. After the interview, I listened to the recording and made detailed notes about what the teachers had said. From these observations, the questionnaire and the interviews, I think I learned a lot about the teaching context and particularly about the organisational constraints under which these teachers were working. Perhaps most obviously, I was struck by the teacher's individuality. Observing 5 teachers, you see 5 different ways of teaching. Personality, experience, and age are all inevitably highly influential in dictating a teacher's style. A second thing I was not expecting to find was that the production and use of worksheets that paralleled the textbook material both appeared to support and stymie individual freedom and control. Somehow there seemed to be an assumption in all the schools that teachers should produce worksheets to supplement the textbook. But because one teacher produced all the worksheets for 1 year group, the other teachers were not able to exert as much control over the materials as they might have liked. The desire for all students to be exposed to exactly the same materials in exactly the same sequence and at the same pace led to a lockstep and one-size-fits-all approach, which again seemed to stymie individual teacher freedom and control. Interestingly, I discovered that older teachers are not necessarily the more conservative ones. The 2 teachers I observed who were close to retirement were less than convinced that some of their younger colleagues were open to using more innovative techniques. However, there was some evidence that the teachers may feel proprietorial about my method or our methods and a little suspicious of your external TESOL methods. There was also some evidence that teachers feel that doing things differently takes an effort and that it is easier to fit in with the other teachers around them to avoid rocking the boat. I wanted to delve deeper into the teachers' views on continuing teacher development because I reasoned that their sense of agency would relate most closely to their own sense of ongoing professional learning. Agency, I felt, must stem from a desire to reflect on one's own teaching and to explore new ways of doing things. And that sense of exploration would come, I assumed, from seeing how one can give oneself permission to interrogate one's own practice, I assume that that realization might spring from teacher education opportunities. I therefore made a second questionnaire focusing on CPD, which I used to conduct a second interview with 3 of the 5 teachers. Even though there are many constraints, teachers find space to exercise freedom and control over how they teach. The content may be defined, but they see ways of exercising control over how they deliver the content. For them, membership of an informal study group or outside network was the place where teachers explored professional issues with like-minded others. Their idea of continuing professional development was not a familiar concept for them. I had to explain the concept. They also felt that school was not the place for initiating a CPD project, either individually or collaboratively. And they did not have a very high opinion of the regular inset sessions which were offered in school or by the Board of Education. The intention was to extend on the above by observing teachers in 2 new areas, one in downtown Tokyo, the other in a rural area, but then the pandemic intervened. I thought I would have to put the project on hold for a year, but then I began to think that I wanted to collect more data from a larger number of teachers to get a more general picture of what techniques teachers used and what their rationales were for using these techniques. Rather than asking teachers about techniques they do not use, as past surveys have done, and rather than skirting around the issue by asking about material, I decided to ask about the techniques they use and why they use them. So this led to a third questionnaire, but this time large scale and focusing on the teaching techniques teachers use and their rationales. At this point, I realised that my distilled research question was, why do you teach the way you do? And I also realised that I wanted to understand teachers' rationales for the techniques they use. I realised that the survey questions should be based mainly on the techniques that I had observed being used most often. This would make most of the techniques in the survey familiar to most teachers, I assumed, and would enable them to explain their rationales for using their techniques. The rationales given would allow me to see to what extent teachers were exercising principled choices over the techniques they used, and therefore the degree of agency they seemed to have. Belatedly, I realised that the process I have been following is what is called an exploratory sequential design in mixed methods research. First, I collected some qualitative data through class observations, questionnaires and interviews, and by targeting a small group of teachers. Based on what I saw, I designed a survey which asks junior high school teachers about common teaching techniques that they probably regularly use, and it asks them to explain their reasons for using these techniques. I have recently sent out 422 questionnaires to 211 junior high schools in 9 regions throughout Japan, and I am waiting to receive responses. I think the desire to go big at this stage and to embark on a large-scale survey of many teachers' teaching rationales comes from a natural desire to want to generalise beyond the 5 teachers I have observed and interviewed so far. I now know something about 5 people, but I wonder whether the views they have about teaching and the way they teach is shared by others, or whether they were unusual in some way. The desire to go small at the beginning of the project a year ago was based on the feeling that I did not know what kinds of constraints and freedoms teachers work under, and was based on wanting to understand a few people deeply. Now, to go big feels like a natural counterbalancing move to ensure that I am not leaping to conclusions based on the hunches I have developed. This approach is called either multi-method or mixed method research, and in uncovering and trying to understand why teachers in junior high school teach in the ways they do, I think it is absolutely essential to collect local as well as more general data, and to go small as well as to go big. Thank you for listening. I believe there is now a chance for you to ask some questions.